Bryant was campaigning for president. Bryant's campaign against the cross of gold, as he called it, was captured in a metaphorical, legendary book by Frank Baum, known as The Wizard of Oz. Oz stands for ounces of gold, by the way. That most people, including our leaders, have no idea the debt money system is controlled by private corporations, and that the collapse of this debt Ponzi scheme is imminent, and that private banks, or according to the words of Thomas Jefferson, more dangerous than the standing armies, is a reflection of the amnesia of the people. Proposing an end to usury and debt banking seems to be more difficult for the church than to address the other injustices, including climate change. Yet it is the most important issue of all. The situation is as complex as Moses when he was called by God to leave with the Israelites from Pharaoh's Egypt. I suspect many Israelites, again, had no interest in leaving Egypt and spending 40 years in the Sinai. What I'm calling for is perhaps more daunting, since unlike the Israelites, 99% of us are completely unaware that we are debt slaves. Most of us oblivious that we will trade a third of our life energy working to pay interest. This form of financial injustice can only come, unfortunately, I believe, with the utter collapse of the current economic Titanic. Our challenge is to build a more beautiful, joyful, and love-based operating system that makes the old one obsolete. Jesus gave us the tools of prayer and showed us the path of love. God gave us the Garden of Eden and the tree of life. Yet we rejected that too, tempted by the desire to know and continuing to eat from the tree of knowledge. We are a stubborn people. Jesus gave us the most singular, powerful prayer of all. So lest we forget that we should forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. Perhaps then we will find the strength and conviction to end usury, the civilization of consumption, and build this new civilization of love that God longs us to co-create. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we have time for dialogue and questions. For the purposes of the video there, Mark is going to repeat whatever question you ask back and then answer it so that it'll be audible on the video. So go ahead and stand up if you've got a question. All right. And you're going to have to yell it out probably.
This will be the happy part of the session.
A two-part question. The first is the ideas of the economist Schumacher and All is Beautiful. I wonder how they relate, because I often hear them in the same vein, and if you have any comment on that. The second is the rise of equity finance. I'm particularly interested in this in the context of Islamic financing, which is a very rapidly growing field. I was wondering if you would comment on that.
So the first question was reflection on Schumacher's seminal work, Small is Beautiful. And the second was the rise of equity financing, particularly as highly developed in Islam under particular Sharia law. So the first is to say I know Satish Kumar, who's the head of the Schumacher School, and in fact we were on the stage together in The Hague at the new World Financial Forum a few years ago, and Satish he's a Janus. If anyone knows what Janus monks do, they go for these long walks, and so I'm sitting next to his wife Jane, who says, "I'm just a gardener," and Satish says, "Once I lectured at the London School of Economics, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm using his I think he's from Sri Lanka. You're graduating half-wits." He says, "What do you mean half-wits?" Like, well, you've thrown out the ecology from the economics because they're both very connected. Small is Beautiful, I actually reflect on it, the 25th anniversary edition in my book. I think Schumacher himself was an interesting guy. He was a Brit. He went to Burma, was it? And he learned something about, he was intrigued by Buddhist kind of understanding of economy. And if anyone knows anything about ethics and one thing I used to teach my business students, or virtue, I say, with second class, I taught corporate social responsibility for 10 years at the School of Business, and I said, your homework is to look at the different virtues of different religions And what I loved about Buddhism is it was very clear about right relationship, right? So everything as if there is a right way, there's a proper way of doing things. So I think Buddhism has, and Schumacher's ideas has a lot. Of course, Schumacher realized, I think, that he was up against the Titanic of, economic growth. I could talk a lot about this. I've advised the Chinese government at the highest levels. I think all of us are kind of stuck in a system, and I continue to say I think the key driver of that is this debt money system that puts pressure on this need for growth, and actually can't stop growing because there's no way, otherwise the thing will just run out of oxygen, will collapse. On the question of Sharia or Islamic banks have been, the interest-free bank I studied in Sweden, studied very forensically, and I said, could Canadian banks operate without charging interest like the Swedish bank, which was designed in Denmark 45 years ago? And I concluded yes, and what was remarkable is the Imam of Stockholm gave blessing to Muslims to bank at the interest-free bank. So there's some young Muslims in Edmonton who want me to advise them on how to create an interest-free bank. Because, I don't know if you know this, but if you're a Muslim, you're actually not, you're forbidden to charge or pay interest. So Islamic banks, they'll own your property outright, and they'll issue you a loan, but only recover the operating costs of managing that bank. That's exactly how the Swedish bank works. So they reject charging any interest. There's no interest necessary to charge. So it's an interesting model, and it's a kind of new form of I guess sharing in the risk of equity. That our primary one is, of course, homes. Question?
Let's say it's a year from now, and President-elect Sanders calls you up and says he'd like you to be Secretary of Treasury.
It won't happen. Look what happened to Obama.
And he says, I want to do what you want to do. And he says that between Wall Street and Congress, they're going to shut down the economy. What's your next step?
I think that's what Obama faced. I mean, I remember the second week of his first term, I went, did David Corton get invited to see Barack? No. Who was around him? Summers, same old guys. It makes sense. I mean, the same guys that control the system. The U.S. Federal Reserve is a private corporation, incorporated by private banks in Jekyll Island, and nothing's changed. And so I don't, the problem is I don't see, I mean, if you go and look at your own history and you look at what Ben Franklin, and again, I'm not American, so we have a slightly different story in Canada. We didn't go down that path. Britain did. Britain did in 1694 with the Bank of England. So we have a long amnesia about what is possible. But go back to the Founding Fathers' description. Why was the War of Revolution fought? To decouple from those banks in England, in London. And so you have to kind of return. It's going to be hard to go back. Try to go back 2-3 generations to Abraham Lincoln's time and say, I know, we want to blow up. We're going to forgive all the debts in the nation. We're going to just neutralize that $7 trillion in national debt. We're going to just clear the books. And then we're going to put in place, this is what I would do. If I was called to advise whoever the president is, I'd say, first thing, day one, I want all the young economists in the country to help me. I'm going to take inventory of the country's land, buildings, bridges, roads, people, right? I'm going to do a full asset inventory. That's what accountants do. And then I'm going to think about, well, what do I want to sustain here? If I want an economy of well-being, whatever that means, how do I want those assets to behave? What do I want those assets, should the bridges look like? Should we be driving Chevy Volts or Priuses or Teslas? Or I'm not saying we would dictate any of that, but that we would have to look seriously about how the assets of our nation are delivering a well-being return on that investment. And we can create any kind of money system we want to support that. Now, that would be my wildest dreams. I don't think it's going to, it's not going to happen because the whole world is in a debt situation. So the only condition I can see that would ever lead to this would be a collapse of the entire system, which actually could happen. We almost saw it in 2008. So these are some of that's kind of the bad news. So yeah, I've got on my laptop here, I've got the, all right, I can download this for you. Here's the operating system. We've done it for a watershed in Quebec. I could value the watershed at $3 trillion and tell the watershed generate enough liquidity for living wages for everyone in Ottawa and all those Indigenous people, and clean up the watershed, make it healthy again. Stop exporting excess materials from Canada, because we could close our borders. We don't need to trade with anyone. Well, those are things, those would be the tough things that I would urge any president, any leader to do, including our new prime minister. But they don't invite me, say this. Like, dudes, you're not running, like, this is terrible. Like, you have no balance sheet. You're not, what happened to public accounting? That they missed that important part. Anyways, I digress. Question back there.
From what source does this interest-free bank in Sweden get its money to lend out interest-free without paying interest?
So the question is, this interest-free bank in Sweden, which is called the Xaiver Members Bank. Xaiver stands for Land, Labor, and Capital in Danish. So the Danes kind of started it, a bunch of farmers. So how did they start? The farmers in Denmark realized we couldn't get credit from the banks. So what if we started to pool our cash, our liquidity, and then we begin to lend to each other? That's how it starts. So in effect, it's a lending circle that a quarter of the funds are then invested in Swedish treasury. So that's their hedge against potential default. It's a very cool system. It's a kind of a forced saving system. So at the beginning, the loans are very small. Maybe, because it just depends on how many people. We could create it tonight. We say, who's got $1,000? We're gonna build this interest-free bank in Cincinnati right now, right? We could do it. We don't even need a legal document. We do it in our churches, and so of course, we've got the operating model. We can go to Sweden and learn from them. So but the problem too is the Xaiver Bank operates still within this larger matrix, right? So if you think about would you be crazy to put your money in an interest-free deposit account when everything else is growing at least by 0.5%? So there's inflation, right, which is eroding the value of that pool. So not everyone, of course, puts all their money in this bank. So these are some of the challenges, but it exists as a model, as a template for what's possible. And that's what I was intrigued by. It is possible to do banking without interest. And the point is that the costs of running the bank are recovered. It's a cooperative membership structure. So we all put $50 in a year. The costs of operating the bank are recovered through what they call a loan fee. So that fee just covers, it's just like any business, right? Say it's 1% of the cost of any loan. And it operates pretty efficiently. And there's no marketing. It's all word of mouth. It's by coffee clubs across Sweden.
My question is more on accounting for.
Oh, you're the accounting student, aren't you?
So I'm curious more about the genuine progress index and how companies are taking into account and reporting on non-financial metrics, and kind of what your thoughts are about how that lines up with your metrics. They're looking at human rights and sourcing of where their products are going and how it's consumer, water footprint, other sustainability reporting.
Right. So the question is, which is the subject of lots of interest, is how are companies starting to account for these, what I would call these intangible assets, water footprint, things like trust and relationships, right? So-called intangibles. Well, some of us recognize that we've gone long enough since World War II that we've moved from a kind of a built infrastructure kind of economy to what I would call relational economy, where the assets of most companies now are more trust. And if you're studying accounting, what do your accounting professors tell you about goodwill? How should you value it?
Just evaluate it carefully.
And how do you determine the value of goodwill?
There are a lot of qualitative and quantitative metrics.
That sounds like mumbo jumbo to me. Sorry.
If you want me to go.
Where's an accounting professor? No, that's a good point. So goodwill, that we were talking about what's goodwill. Well, goodwill is supposedly, right, goodwill. Well, how do you measure the value of goodwill? Your customer lists. How about going into a cafe and talking to customers? How happy are you with your espresso this morning, right? I can go, and I jokingly say, I can go do a happiness audit, tonight at any restaurant and look at people's smiling faces, go back in the kitchen, see how grumpy their chefs are. I can do an interesting audit, and I can tell that owner very quickly that they got some relational capital deficits here, or they got a lot of strengths because they're getting 5 stars or whatever from their customers. You look at Uber. So we see the emergence of new ways of measuring trust with stars or whatever. TaskRabbit, Airbnb, and so accountants haven't caught up to this, in my opinion, in the sense of how do you measure these intangibles in a way that it's not always monetized. In accounting, there's two ways. There's tax and audit. Sorry, that's all technical stuff. And then there's management accounting. Management accounting's gone missing. Management accounting is a realm of strategy. Where are we going, right? How happy are our customers? How happy are our staff, right? And we've developed with my little group called Genuine Wealth protocols for doing well-being audits of companies and actually showing business people how to, measure the well-being of your employees, including their spiritual well-being, right? And put that boldly, in the Volvo dealership, you got the well-being smiley face index, right? And when you walk in, you're like, how come the service guys are so grumpy? Aren't they supposed to, they're called service. Well, because you got some front person who's shaking your hand, taking your money, and you walk in, you're all stressed, like, oh, I'm going to pay a lot for my Volvo repair, and you never shake the hand of Joe in the back. Those things like common sense stuff, but none of that stuff will appear on Volvos, right? Accounting statements. So we're into a new realm of pioneering, but we have to catch up to, I think, the reality that these intangibles, particular relationships, are more than just some mumbo-jumbo qualitative assessment. Because they do ultimately, I think, affect your bottom line. I don't know if that helps you. Sort of. Not satisfied. Yes?
Have you been to Bhutan and studied the national happiness?
No, but I've hung out with the Prime Minister in the UN. In 2012, I was invited by the Prime Minister to meet at this amazing meeting at the United Nations, and Prince Charles was talking to us, and the UN Secretary General. And I have to say, as much as Bhutan is this wow, the happiness kingdom, it's like the Swedes and the Danes are the happiest nation in the world. The more homogeneous you are, if you have a benevolent king who can kind of go, you will live this way, you will have no TVs. What was interesting, one of my favorite speeches was at UTEP in El Paso. Never been to Texas. And the University of Texas is known as Bhutan on the border with Juarez, where they're killing each other across the border. And all the buildings are built in Bhutanese architecture. And I met all these young Bhutanese students from Bhutan. I said, tell me what it's really like, right? So we were the president of the university, all these. He says, we think the king's going too fast. We're like 20-year-olds, and we think the young king has opened the borders too quickly. I said, oh, that's interesting. Now we have a new prime minister. The prime minister I met in 2012, out. Why? Because there's all this pressure. Now they open their borders. Now the kids want their iPads, right? Now we got to start exporting, just like everybody else. Who are we going to trade with, China or India? So now a pro-business prime minister is in. So I was invited to come in 2 weeks ago. I was supposed to be in Bhutan. I said, are you going to pay my way? Oh, no, we don't have any money for that. It's like, well, hey, I got to put bread on the table too. I can't just jump on a plane as much as I'm romantic about. So, but that said, Bhutan has done some amazing things. A few of us Canadians have actually helped write the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Household Survey, which takes 8 hours to fill out. They don't have computers, so you got to do it a log sheet. So we're using some of those analytic surveys now in Canada to look at well-being. So Bhutan is definitely a model. I don't think they've gone the ultimate step, which I would call a well-being-based governance system, but they're definitely a shining example of, in a sea of otherwise kind of despairing pro-growth, economies. Yeah. But again, my point is, When you open those borders, when you open your culture, right, that materialism comes rushing in, and it'll corrupt them too. So they have to watch it.
How much of the fact that we are actually suffering the curse of abundance that is causing our problems?
I think I have Pastor Rob. We were talking about that over dinner. The question is, how much do we think is the factor of consumption, right?
The curse of abundance.
The curse of abundance. Actually, that's a great point. That's something I often reflect on because, Alberta, where I come from, we have the world's third largest reserve of oil and gas. It's called the tar sands, oil sands. We have a super abundant, except now when the oil is $45, so we're all crying, right? Can't pay for my F-150 truck. And it's so there is a kind of paradox that I think that's a paradox of abundance. I think the truth is we have more than enough. So how do we, I would say sustainability is a big challenge. How can we relax into the truth of abundance? Because the lie is scarcity. And I love the word, probably people know this, the word fear. I love the word fear. False evidence appearing real. So our challenge is, even if we wanted to slow down, if we wanted to, I consider myself a villain of GDP because we have no debt and we've lowered our income needs have gone down because I have no mortgage anymore. So what does that mean? I can buy more stuff, buy a cottage or something, better car. But the choice to say no to that and say, wait a minute, that means I have more discretionary time to spend with young people or walk the girls to school. Those are luxuries that I think I want everyone to have. But compelling someone to make that choice to live more simply is difficult when we're encouraged that material things bring us happiness, when in fact most of us know that it's not true. So I think we have a challenge we have a spiritual malaise, we have some serious soul searching to do. But it's an interesting conundrum that the truth is abundance, and yet money has become this kind of, it's broken that, I think that's why Jesus got mad at the money changers, saying, what are you charging a tax on? This is a pure, it's a pure offering to God. So, big challenges. Question?
Question is, if you were to build a new, from scratch, let's say a society of 300 people, how much do you think that